Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Florida Family Leader Network webinar. I am Angela Miney, the coordinator of the FFLN, and I'd like to welcome you today to our presentation on supported decision making. Just some logistics before we get started. All of your phones are muted. I would ask you to enter questions in the chat box. If there's time at the end, we can certainly open up the lines for some discussion. I wanted to remind people that this session is being recorded and we will archive it and make it available after the presentation. And we will also be sending you an evaluation after the event also.
Which one do I do?
I am going
I click on that one, but I'm not sure.
I am going to stop sharing my screen now so that Tina Campanella, today's presenter, can put her slides up. And while Tina is doing that, I want to just tell you a little bit about the Quality Trust. The mission of the Quality Trust is to be an independent catalyst for change in the lives of people of all ages with developmental disabilities. They partner with people and their families so that they can succeed, thrive, and experience full membership in the communities they choose. They work with individuals and family members to solve problems, identify opportunities for learning and contribution, and find creative ways to minimize differences and make the most of each person's abilities. They are recognized as the national experts in supported decision making, and I am delighted to welcome Tina Campanella to the FFLN today to share her expertise on supported decision making. Over to you, Tina.
Well, thank you so much, Angela. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I'm honored to have been invited to join you and to talk a little bit about supported decision making. As Angela so nicely said, I am the CEO of Quality Trust for Individuals with Disabilities. We are based in Washington, D.C., and we view ourselves as an independent monitoring and advocacy organization that is really focused on helping people with the developmental disabilities in particular live the best life possible. We work with both children and adults, and we also serve in the capacity to be an independent monitor of services provided through our local city government. And since 2014, we have been the host of the National Resource Center on Supported Decision Making. How that came about is that through our advocacy work in the District of Columbia, it became very obvious to us that this issue of decision making and control of one's life was pretty central to people having a good life. And we started first with focus on guardianship and really reform of how people were supported in decision making, and over the years kind of grew into this whole notion of how could we do it differently that we'll be talking about today, and that has evolved into what is now a nationwide effort, or actually more accurately a worldwide effort to really support people with disabilities in a different way to be in control and make decisions in their life. So where I thought we should start is with the very beginning, kind of just trying to get a very fundamental definition of when I say supported decision making, what am I talking about? We have defined it in some ways as a fundamental right for people. If you think about it, the whole notion of autonomy is an important one, especially in our American culture. But it's sort of the ability to really have agency, if you will, over what happens to first and foremost your immediate world, you know, the things around you, your buddy, and you know, where you go and who you're with, and then spreading out to all aspects of how your life evolves is a fundamental right of being in the world, if you will. And so supported decision making is really about that. It's about helping people to get whatever help they need, regardless of what kind of challenges or differences that they experience in life, and to express their preference and have that preference be the guiding beacon or element that people around that person respect and utilize as a way of providing support and crafting what happens in people's lives. Fundamentally for us, this whole notion of working with the person, starting with the person, listening to the person, and then supporting the person and utilizing that person's expressed opinions and preferences as you know, a key fundamental driver of how supports are delivered is a bottom line for us. And when you look even in guardianship, it's not what you see happening a lot, but if you were to test out the best practices in guardianship, you would really find that it's a fundamental principle of best practice, even under guardians. So this whole notion of we always have to start with the person and we always have to consider that person's opinion. And unless there's something specific causing us not to utilize that opinion and will and preference, that is how we should, that those will and preferences is what should guide how we provide supports. So that's really what I'm talking supported decision making. I'm not really talking about it as a thing. It has become a thing in some places, and I'll talk about that toward the end. But this is really a way of approaching decision making and people with disabilities that really fundamentally mirrors how anyone else in the world makes decisions in their life. And I think, and I hope that that will become clear as we go through this presentation. I also thought it was important to sort of give a little history of where a supported decision came from. You know, it was not born recently. I think in its purest form, you can kind of link it back to a lot of work that has been done over many, many years to really reform guardianship and get guardianship to a place where it really is providing the kind of assistance and support people were deemed to need when the guardianship was pursued, without necessarily having the kind of personality or expressed opinions of the persons being ignored. So there's a lot of work done in that area, but really the kind of seminal work that really kicked off, I think, what I would consider the supported decision-making movement was linked to the UN Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities in the early 2000s. And in that convention, there is an Article 12 that talks very specifically about envisioning a world without guardianship, envisioning a world where every person has their legal capacity to direct their lives respected as a fundamental right of humanity. And what you need to think about that is recognizing that even though we want to support people and we recognize some people need protection and assistance, it's a delicate balance to kind of put those protections in place in a way that doesn't obliterate that person's, again, agency or direction or fundamental uniqueness as an individual. This Article 12, and if you can find it, it's a great resource to use, really describes this vision of legal capacity for all a variety of supports that would enable people to exercise their legal capacity and really get whatever assistance they need in decision making, and that clearly placing guardianship as this removal of the right that should only be done in the most extreme cases when everything else has failed or when the circumstances are so urgent that they require someone to step in and act in the shoes of the person because their preferences, will and preferences can't be known or aren't known in a certain given situation. So that's sort of the history here. It's really been over the past couple decades that this has been emerging as a practice and as an alternative. I will tell you, guardianship has thousands of years on supported decision making. So people are still in the early stages of really trying to wrap their heads around how does supported decision making fit in with all that. And again, I say this as a context for all of the things I'm going to say today, because it really is kind of a movement to get people to think differently about how we support people and where those supports come from, when they come, and how we deliver them. So fundamentally, it's about decisions, right? And so you need to think about decision making and people with disabilities. In particular, people with developmental disabilities, it's a challenge, right? Because for many, many years, there have been very low expectations about what people with disabilities will be able to do in the future. A lot of people, even based on early diagnosis, will, very quickly and commonly come to conclusions about what a person can and cannot do. And then based on those conclusions, prescribe a set of life experiences, be it education, be it work, be it community integration, or whatever arena you're talking about, that are consistent with what they feel is right for a person. So low expectations, visions of people as, someone who will be a child forever. One of the things that within my work, we try very hard to get people to rethink is the shorthand language when people are talking about people have a mental age of fill in the blank, as if that were a thing. Just as an aside, for my advocacy, I always like to remind people that the gentleman who created mental age in his lifetime quickly decided that it was not a good thing, precisely for the reason that we're still struggling with today, that it doesn't mean, it's a test score, and it doesn't mean that your brain won't develop. It simply means it was a kind of an age equivalent thing, but unfortunately, it took hold, and it has survived Binet and all of the psychologists since to being something we still hear commonly talked about in the work of supporting people with disabilities. So low expectations and limited vision for who people are and what they can become in the future lead to limited opportunities, overprotection, and a lot of decisions about what people can't do. And so we have to put that in the context of the larger human decision making and what we know about how people like you and me make decisions. And what we can learn by looking at the literature and research. And it's very interesting because over the past couple of decades, there has been a lot more research about decision making and how people make decisions and what's the processes they use. We find that what is known is that decision making for your typical average person is pretty flawed. Most people, outside a few professions that are driven to make very systematic decisions around their work, are not taught good decision-making skills. So our cultural and personal values are also often function as biases about our decision-making lenses, if you will, through which we make decisions. One person's good decision-making is viewed by others as a bad decision. So it's very subjective. We can be very judgmental about it. And if you look at the literature, the other thing it says is that everybody can learn to be a better decision maker. It is a process that can be taught. It's not often taught, but it can be, and it is taught in some arenas. So we could put that. You know, I encourage people to often think about how you learn to become a decision maker. At what age did your mom and dad start backing off and letting you assert more of your opinions and start taking over responsibility for the clothes you wore or the food you ate, or, you know, different parts in your life? And is that happening in the same way for people with disabilities? And then even when you reach the age of majority, which in most places is 18, none of us were automatically good decision makers. We were just legally the decision maker, because that's this age of majority. And as we got to make decisions legally, then we started really exercising that agency and autonomy, and through good and bad decisions, learned a lot. So if you can think about between age 18 and put a number on where it is you became a better decision maker, for me, I think it was somewhere around 30 to 32, where I had made enough screw ups. You know, I got married and got divorced and lived on my own, had a series of roommates, really decided what I wanted in life, and got enough confidence in living that I decided I was going to go for it. So you can see it's a lot of different variables that can often influence decision making. And as a typical part of life, people just develop those skills over time and through interactions with a lot of different people. So if you think about people with disabilities in the context of larger decision making, our support really should be throughout the lifespan. Okay, so we should be thinking about, as kids with disabilities are learning, how do we set kids up for success? What do they need to start learning? And what are the things, what are the tools that they need to really set them on a path that ultimately will lead them to, you know, the maximum amount of autonomy and agency in their adult life. And you can look at all of these different stages, and there are different decision-making variables that will come into play, all the way from, you know, again, preparing as a young adult to move into adulthood, then as adults really, you know, taking control of their lives, all the way up to as people prepare, you know, for their later years, making decisions about, you know, who you want to help you with things, you know, should you lose capacity as time moves on, and what you want to have happen, you know, kind of as you end your life and after you're gone. So there's a whole range of lifespan issues around decision making to be considered. So how do we approach this? First of all, okay, so let me just reinforce here. I think that when we talk about who the supported decision making is for, we have to presume that supported decision making is for everybody. It's for every person with a disability, and the actual type of decision making support we provide to them is going to have to be crafted individually as we figure out what that person needs, what that person kind of support that person prefers, and what will best support them. But let's really talk about the hows. If you're really focusing on, how are we going to support people, the first element I think that is really critical here is a focus on what could we do, where could we go, and what pathways, plural, are important and consistent with what we see emerging from the person's preference, what we know about the person's preferences and the person's need for support. So focusing on the possible and not overly focusing on the potential problems or things that could go wrong. Things will go wrong on their own. They really don't need us to focus there. They need us to focus on what will it take, what could be possible, how do we open up opportunities for people to be exposed to the widest range of life experiences, and then learn from those life experiences as a way of building the person's portfolio, if you will, of preferences and likes and dislikes and things that can guide the people providing support around them. Second thing, and I really want to emphasize this, within the context of a lifespan, one of the things we have seen absolutely critical is communication as a fundamental way of understanding who people are. So functional communication, not eloquent verbal discourse like I'm doing here, but basic control elements like yes, no, happy, sad, I want it, I don't want it, those sorts of things, is a priority for everybody. So every person with a disability must have these basic elements of communication as a fundamental way to start the communication and to start the decision-making relationship with people around them. Now, the other thing that we absolutely see as critical is that professionals and family members who are trying to support people need to understand that we need to be good communication partners with those folks, which means we need to figure out what it is we need to do in order to facilitate their expression. So some people may never express themselves with words. So we need to be creative in thinking about what other ways do they communicate to us. Again, starting with the very basics. I'm happy, I'm not happy. I am comfortable, I'm not comfortable. I'm feeling well, I'm not feeling well. Those basic elements, and then utilizing that basic communication as a way to build on people's decision-making ability. Now, where I'll tell you we've seen this most powerfully is with many young adults with autism who, without the ability to communicate with the people around them, they've been in extreme frustration. And then when given access to a reliable means of communication, what we found is they have a lot to say. And part of what was exhibiting as behavioral challenges was really an extreme frustration around not being able to get that message out to the people who were there and trying to help, but not understanding what help was most useful. And so I use that as an example, really just to underscore communication is so important. There are many of us who are dying to help other people, but we just can't help them if we don't understand the world from their perspective. So it is, again, a fundamental how that isn't all that sexy, but it is really critical, and especially in the arena of decision making. And then finally, the pillars of providing support. And we need to really think about what does that support look like. And, it could be in the context of almost anything. If you think of decision-making in the most general terms, when you go to make a decision, sometimes the decision, depending on what it is, involves collecting information. You may do that from people around you. You may do that from the internet. You may do that from reading, from observing, from almost taking a class. Support in its broadest sense could be almost anything. So the message here is to, when we think about the support part of decision making, it's really a matter of meeting each person where they are and then figuring out what supports are best. And it's important to say what supports are best for what decisions, because the other element of this is the support I may want around making decisions about my money may be different than the support I want about making decisions relative to my health. And that may be totally different than the support I want about making decisions about where I live and who I live with, or my most personal relationships. So, thinking about setting up support systems, we need to think not only about what kind of support, but what kind of support for what kind of decisions. And having the broadest network of people is really the most recommended, because what we've found in executing these, what we call supported decision-making power of attorneys for folks, is that they're very detailed, and very often people do want different people in their lives around different things, and they want those people to do different things around different types of decisions. So, recognizing that supported decision-making is a skill, we need to think about what are the things that we can do starting from early on to assist people with decision-making. We were very proud when we finally got the District of Columbia school system to take on integrating decision-making and quote-unquote self-determination throughout all of their special education curriculum. In the earliest stages of decision-making, it can be around deciding about your snacks, deciding about how you're going to use your playtime, deciding about how you want to decorate your cubby. There could be all sorts of things that could be early, rudimentary, low barrier decisions around which people can learn what it's like to exercise a certain level of autonomy in your life and practice without having the risk of really bad consequences coming. What we see, unfortunately, is people not investing early on in the type of decision-making support and learning opportunity. And then when folks get to 18, people panic and say, I'm really scared that the decisions folks will make are not going to be great ones, and the consequences will be bad. And of course, that may be true. But if that support relationship can be in place as people reach the age of majority, then it just extends into adulthood. And the reality is, again, I want to reinforce that almost none of us make decisions in isolation. We're all using some form of support in our decision making, whether it be relying on a partner or a family member or information or other sorts of things as we consider the major decisions in our lives. Good news is that with the recent explosion of information about how brains work, and I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm not going to go into here, but I would tell you there's a lot of information out there that you can access, and it's very interesting. But with the explosion of information, what we know is that it is through doing that people are learning. And without doing, people's brains do it, we're actually creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we don't include people in decision making, we are actually contributing to people not becoming worse at decision making. So it's really incumbent on us, based on what we're learning about how the brain works, even though if people have protections in their life, to include people in the decision making as a way of keeping them active and maximizing whatever potential they have for participation in decision making. And just as an example of kind of going back to how basically we can understand kind of the decision making process, where it can go awry, and how we can help people become better decision makers. I've given you a list of things that are very common. You know, when people make bad decisions, it's very often they're driven by things like fear or reaction or oversimplification, not really understanding all of the elements involved in a decision. And so, you know, recognizing what can go wrong with decision making, we can really emphasize the elements that will help us make better decisions. So this whole notion of being more analytical, stepping back, taking a look at the big picture, identifying what's out there that can help us make this decision, inviting different people to share their different perspectives without negatively reacting, immediately to that input, but really creating a situation in which we're really thinking about what are all aspects of this decision. That's very fundamentally can help us become better decision makers over time. For people with disabilities, and the actual tools that are out there are tools that are available to everybody. And our preference always is to use the same things that people without disabilities will use, because it just reinforces the notion that people with disabilities are people, just like everybody else. And if you and I can exercise powers of attorney and give certain people the authority to act on our behalf or act with us, then people with disabilities can do the same thing. I'm very excited these days to see the medical community in particular really practicing some of this within the healthcare arena. So when I went last year to get my regular colonoscopy, part of the intake documentation that was presented to me was the information around HIPAA, and there was a form there that indicated that they would be willing to share information with anyone I designated. And I just needed to say who I designated as authorized to get the information. And so it was a release of information form. It's not as high element as power of attorney, but it could be, again, another tool in your toolbox, rather than saying that after age 18, doctor can only talk to the person, and if the person can't talk to the doctor, then they need to have some sort of guardianship, and the parents or somebody has to have guardianships in order to support the person. Not true. A release of information, if the person can sign that, can allow mom, dad, or anybody else they prefer to be part of the medical decision making with them. If you wanted to go a step more formal, again, obviously using powers of attorney would be the next level of executing a power of attorney. People, professionals like doctors, banks, even educational institutions understand powers of attorney. Sometimes they need to be encouraged to do that. Again, with education, release of information, there's a form, a FERPA form, which is the Educational Release of Information form, that could be used, but the power of attorney, again, for education, works just as well. And we often work with the professionals and say, look, this is just a step that enables you to have a legal document that says, you know, you've done your due diligence and that this arrangement is something that the person wants, and you were kind of encouraged to follow that. Different other things here on the list that you could think about. Again, wills are common ways people codify what they want to have happen after they're gone. Trusts are a way to set up an extra level of decision making to assist people with money. You understand that's exactly what the representative payee system was designed to do, although it hopefully will work better when the person designates the representative payee instead of having a representative payee selected for the person. And other sorts of tools like letters of intent and financial planning or just tax planning are things that you could use to set forth a structure that can assist people with different types of decisions. It's really important for me just to say a few words about guardianship, because I think when we talk about decision making, very often people say kind of guardianship or supported decision making. And to some degree, supported decision making is a tool that can help us avoid the need for guardianship. But many of the principles that we talk about for supported decision making are consistent with best practices in guardianship. So I absolutely, don't want you to hear the message that guardianship is bad, supported decision making is good. Guardianship is what it is, but it is a court action that takes people's rights away. So when there is a guardian, there has been a determination that the person can't make decisions in some area of their life, and the decision making is not shifted to the person who serves in the role of guardian. The decision making is shifted to the court, right? And because the decision making is shifted to the court, the person then becomes a ward of the court, and the person that acts in the role of guardian is actually just an agent of the court. And I emphasize these things because I can't tell you the number of times I've taken a call from people, and family members are the most heartbreaking, who were told by well-meaning professionals to go get guardianship over their adult child, or their child who was turning in adulthood at age 18. They did it without understanding what they were doing. They thought what they were doing is going and having the court give them guardianship. What they did is they went and had the court take guardianship and make the person a ward of the court and allow the family to act as their agent. And why this is important is because the court holds the guardianship, the court can remove the parent or add in someone else as a decision maker at their will, right? Even over the objection of the parent. And we have seen this happen over and over again. And what we often tell parents is you can go do guardianship, but if you're in a better position to support your child independent of the court if you use these other tools. And then if they're not working, you can always pursue guardianship. So guardianship is always an option, but if you use it as the first option, you've actually invited the court into your life versus created a situation where your family has the authority to operate independently. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Again, as a resource, I highly recommend something that was created by the American Bar Association. This is, I talked earlier about guardianship reform, and this is a great tool to help. It was designed for lawyers, but it's in really plain language. So it helps people who are thinking about whether or not guardianship is necessary to really go through the steps And the word practical actually stands for things. So here are the 9 steps that make up this word practical. And it's just really very basic stuff. You know, it's about presuming, first of all, that people can be supported without guardianship, and then going through a process of considering all of the elements that could be used in the community without, you know, actually pursuing guardianship. And then if you get to the conclusion that actually for this situation or this person, guardianship is necessary, the last element is making sure that whatever guardianship petition is submitted requests the smallest amount of authority to be assumed as possible. Again, the idea is that you can expand it if necessary, but you don't want to expand it too far without a good, compelling reason. Couple more things. I talked about where we are right now in kind of supporting decision-making and kind of balancing out this whole notion of recognizing supported decision-making as another tool, as a tool that's as good as and more appropriate in some situations than guardianship for people. We have, again, the Bar Association's uniformed commission on guardianship and conservatorship. And this is a commission that kind of creates sample laws. A couple of years ago, that commission completed work on a Uniformed Guardianship Act that can be adopted by states. And typically what happens is states look to this uniform commission to set out what best practices are, and then they can either adopt it in whole or they can take elements of it. At this point, Maine and Washington have adopted the entire thing. The important thing to note about this is it notes supported decision-making as a legitimate option that can prevent people from needing guardianship. And then it goes on to talk about how many of the principles around good supported decision-making really are integrated into the guardianship practice, consistent with best practices in guardianship. We're seeing more and more states include references around support for decision-making in different laws that they're making. And then we have several states who actually made supported decision-making laws. The District of Columbia is one, and there are a number of other places. But we also like to reinforce at this point, you don't need a law in order to do supported decision-making. All you need to do is be a good advocate. People with disabilities are people first. They turn 18 just like everybody else. They have a right to make their own decisions, and they have a right to say who it is they want to help them in life and how it is they want those people to help them with decision makings. And those things can be codified in a variety of different ways. One of the other resources I want to be sure that you know about is the National Resource Center on Supported Decision Making. This is the website, supporteddecisionmaking.org. We have resources state by state. We have different samples there. For example, there's a sample power of attorney form that, again, is used in different places. And you can, we have links to different projects and other, tools that people are working on. So it's a really great place to go and explore. There's webinars, there's different videos that have all been collected together. We do our best to keep it up to date, but it's a work in progress because there are great things happening throughout the country. And you have to remember that when it comes to things like guardianship, there are recommendations that are nationwide that are come through things like the American Bar Association, but all actual laws are local. So you have to consider what's happening state by state because every state has a different twist on things. All right, so I'm going to pause there. I recognize it's about 1:15. Angela, do you want to open it up for questions, or do you have questions that people are wanting to ask?
So, so yes, thank you, Tina. That was really wonderful, and I was reminded right from the beginning how important appropriate decision making is for all of our children, regardless of their challenges. So we do have one question in the chat box. I have a question, but I would also invite people to either chat in questions, or if you do have the ability to unmute your own phone lines. And so if you would like to tell us what your question is, please feel free to unmute your line. You just click on the little phone icon, and don't all talk at once, but we would welcome questions. So I was wondering, Tina, if you could talk a little bit about shared decision-making in the medical context, and how it is the same or different to supported decision-making.
Great. No, that's a great question. And it is a wonderful thing, but it is not the same thing. So the medical community has had this shared decision-making movement, and it is exactly what it is. It's a very strong effort to be sure that they're including patients in the decision-making process, that they're paying attention to the differences that each patient brings to the healthcare arena. So it's their way to recognize different biases and cultural backgrounds, and different elements that are in addition to whatever medical condition the person is experiencing. So it's a way to work in concert with the person around decision making, but it is in the context of healthcare. So it's in the end, and it's from the perspective of the healthcare professional. So in the end, while the patient can make their decision independent, the healthcare provider is going to make their decision independent. So it's an effort to get those two people just talking a little bit better. That's shared decision making. So supported decision making is about the person making their own decision. So you could have the two things going on at the same time. So the healthcare professional kind of reaching out and working more closely with the person with a disability, and the person with a disability bringing their support network to participate in that shared decision-making. But ultimately, the supported decision-making element there would be the person with a disability deciding whether or not to agree with the healthcare professional or not, and what their treatment options would be. Okay, so in the end, under shared decision-making, the healthcare professional, after taking into consideration all of the person's perspective, is going to have a recommendation. So they may recommend, for example, if you had, let's use cancer as an example. So, let's say you're a woman and you had a lump in your breast, and you had a lumpectomy. Post-lumpectomy, there are treatment options. And so your healthcare professional will engage in shared decision-making with you around exploring those options. But in the end, they're going to say, well, I really strongly recommend that you pursue, having radiation, and, then follow up with this oral medication that you take for 5 years. And then the patient is going to have to come to their own conclusion about what it is that they're going to do. And that's where they'll need support in order to say, yes, I'm going with the recommendation of my healthcare professional, or yeah, I'll go along with this part, but I don't want to go along with that part, and I'm not going to. Was that helpful?
Yes, very much so. And at a very practical level, I was reminded when you were talking about going to your own visit to a recent clinic and being able to designate other people to speak on your behalf or to share information with them.
Mm-hmm.
I was reminded of when my own daughter turned 18 and she was continuing to get care within at the University of Florida, where she had been in pediatrics, but she was kind of transitioning within that system to some adult providers, that it was so cumbersome actually to continue to so she was invited, or I was the one encouraging her to allow me to participate in her care from the point of view of, that I could still speak to her doctors, or I could take a phone call for her if that need be, because she was still living at home. And, every clinic that we went to, she had to sign the form again. It wasn't embedded within the system, so if we signed it in one department, or she gave me permission in one department, it was allowed throughout. And I was just thinking that I just liked the idea that they were so proactive in putting the form under your nose to a certain extent. And it wasn't always like that.
No, I think that's right. And it's a good example of kind of how slow progress is, but there is progress. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have another question, and an excellent presentation. And the question is regarding mental age terminology. So I have a question regarding how the mental age terminology began. So you mentioned somebody at the beginning who actually defined, I guess, what a mental age was. If you did say who that person was, or if you could talk about that again. And then the second part of the question is, so I know this is from one of our social workers, and she's asking if there are any resources for physicians, psychologists, regarding his response to using this language.
Okay, so it was Alfred Binet back when he created the first intelligence test that created this mental age idea. And again, the best resource I can direct you to is there was just this past, I guess it was last year, the National Council on Disability published the second of two major reports on guardianship and decision-making for people with disabilities. And there is actually a chapter in there about this mental age that gives some references to kind of rely on. It kind of describes what I described. That basically, quite frankly, it's still something you'll see in some intelligence tests, but the concept has kind of taken on a life of its own, and people use it as a shorthand without good awareness of how it's misused. It's very similar in my mind to when we tell parents to go get guardianship. They think they're going to the store and buying it, and they're going to bring it home and put it on their shelf, and that's it. You say the mental age, and it's a way to sort of describe how people are thinking at a given time. But the implication, why it's so dangerous, is the implication is, well, that's just their brain is fixed. that's where they are. No, that's how they tested on a test. What we know about brains is they continue to grow and change. And the person may never be a good test taker. They may always screw up the test, but their brain can change over time. It's just a matter of what stimulus it's given. And again, the brain science of recent decades has shown us this through this wonderful, functional magnetic resonance imagery that we're getting. We're learning so much more about really how brains work than we ever thought. And it's disproving some of the things we thought we knew. Like I said, I would encourage you to sort of look up the National Council on Disability, go to their website, look at some of their recent reports, and there's very good references in there about this. And like I said, one whole chapter of the most recent reports in there. And the other resource is, I'm a great fan of TED Talks because you really get to hear experts talking for themselves. And there are some, I wish I had thought to include on here, but there's some really good ones about this brain science and what kind of the cutting edge neuroscientists are learning about how the brain really works. That can be really good references to share with people. So it's a great question. That's what I have as an answer now, and it's maybe something we should put more resources on the National Resource Center on. So thanks for helping me think about that one.
And as you were responding, I'd like to thank Linda Starnes. She actually posted a couple of the resources that you mentioned from the National Council on Disabilities in the chat box, so people can click on those and open them and save them, and they'll also be available afterwards. So we're getting, so Linda also mentions that there's a very good series on ethics / bioethics and disabilities from the National Council on Disabilities, and that's probably also available on their website. So this has been really excellent, and we could continue talking about this. I certainly have lots more questions for you. I am conscious that we have just a couple of more minutes. I would, if I could ask you to multitask, I'd like to ask you another question, but also ask you if you could stop sharing your screen so that I could just put up a final slide. So while you're doing that, you mentioned at the beginning about this concept of, teaching people from very early on about decision making, which obviously is important for all our kids, but even more important for our children who have challenges. And you also mentioned that you were very proud of, in the District of Columbia, that you were able to have it incorporated more into the ESE curriculum. And I was just wondering if you would comment briefly on what you're seeing in the rest of the country. I mean, is the rest of the country lagging far behind? Are there other sort of model states that are doing really well? I'm tempted to ask, do you have any idea how Florida is doing in terms of, or maybe I shouldn't ask that.
No, I think I'm very encouraged by the number of states that have different projects going. So there's great stuff going on in Florida, and I think your Disability Rights Florida has been a leader in this, and I would encourage you to reach out to them because I think they could be a good resource for you in understanding kind of the different things that are going on here, both in terms of policy changes and just practical supports. Because it's also local, it is hard to say that there are, who's doing best. But I think they're really innovative things. And again, I would just encourage you to go to the National Resource Center. As part of that project, we had the privilege of doing what we called seed grants, where we partnered with people in different places who were really eager to make local change. And so some of those projects are highlighted, and what they were able to accomplish is described. And there's lots of work to do. So it really is a work in progress. It's important work, and that's the biggest thing I would want to leave you with. It's going to take continued effort, and it's important that we do so, because what we're learning is that it's not just a nice to do thing for people with disabilities. It really is fundamental to people's overall protection. I think one of the biggest things that we've seen is that people thought guardianship was a protection. And what the data is currently telling us, data from like the National Core Indicators, data coming out of the Council on Quality and Leadership around outcomes, is that people who are able to control their lives, to express themselves, to have their opinions respected, are more confident, more happier, healthier, and more likely to be free from abuse and neglect, because they're less likely to be isolated and unsure of themselves in terms of how to take care of business. And so again, that's the final point for me. I just want to thank you so much for inviting me to do this, and would love to collaborate with any of you guys going forward. I'm so happy that you were interested in supporting this.
Well, this has been a wonderful presentation, Tina. I'm sorry we can't continue to go on longer. I will just mention that Viviana Bonilla Lopez is with Disability Rights Florida and is doing a pilot project in Miami-Dade County. She has also provided her email address in the chat. I will also send it out to people for anybody who wants more information. With your permission, I will also share your slides and links to the Quality Trust. And I just want to remind people that the Florida Family Leader Network is a small but growing network. And if you want some further information, I have included my contact information there. We are in the process of creating a website for the FFLN. We're hoping to have that up in the next couple of months. And I'm just reminded that in the current climate that many of us have new challenges with the current healthcare scare, and our children with disabilities are also being severely challenged at this time. So if anybody finds some really good resources, feel free to share them with me, and I will be happy to send them out to everybody within the FFLN. So with that, Tina, it's a couple of minutes past the hour, and to everybody else, I'd like to thank you all for your participation, and hope that I will see you all on another webinar soon. So thank you everybody for joining.
Take care.